Thanks, Susan. So we're very happy to have Dr. Greg Butcher tonight. He's the Migratory Species Coordinator for the U.S. Forest Service International Programs, working with birds, bats, and monarch butterflies. He's been a traveling bird watcher since he was 11 and has enjoyed birds in all 50 states and many countries. For his PhD at University of Washington, he studied the behavior of Bullock's orioles. He studied in Costa Rica with the Organization for Tropical Studies and has worked closely with BirdLife International and its national partner organizations for the past 18 years. And he's previously worked for National Audubon Society, the American Birding Association, Partners in Flight, Birders World Magazine, the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and he's a fellow of the American Ornithological Society. So we are thrilled to have Greg tonight, and I will turn it over to you. Go ahead and share your screen.
Okay, now you should be able to hear me. Let's see if I can get my screen up. Oh, this looks good.
Great, thank you.
Now we can see if we can make the slides. Oh, look at that, it's gonna move too. Okay, so I'm gonna tell you about my job, which I don't do very often, but I prepared these slides for the American Ornithological Society last year, where we talked about the relevancy of bird conservation. And so we are always thinking about, how do you save the birds? And it turns out that if you want to save the birds, you have to save the planet. And if you want to save the planet, there's actually a lot of people who want to do that. And so there's a lot of partners out there that you can work with. And some people think about biodiversity conservation. Some people are thinking about climate change. And a lot of people are thinking about sustainable livelihoods. There are people out there in poverty that need to make a living. And a lot of the birds that we care about have to share lands with people who are trying to make a living. As you all know, there are a lot of migratory species. And so if you want to save species in the United States, you have got to have habitats mostly in Latin America and the Caribbean, because those species that leave the United States in the wintertime are almost always going to Latin America or the Caribbean. And so I am privileged to have a job where I try to help organizations that are trying to do good conservation in Latin America and the Caribbean. So the reason that you're paying my salary as US citizens and taxpayers is to try to prevent the listing of internationally shared migratory species that are found on national forests and grasslands. So there's about 192 million acres of national forests and grasslands, and they're supporting a huge number of migratory bird species, many of which are going to Latin America, the Caribbean. To do conservation work in that part of the world, we're working primarily with non-governmental organizations, and you have to do a wide variety of work. We really focus on habitat conservation and habitat improvement. But in order to know what to do, we need to do research in many cases to understand habitat requirements of the birds. We've got to do monitoring, especially to find out where the birds are. And then we need to educate the local people so the local people care about the birds in their area. And then outreach, you need to get a little public awareness. So you want to be in the newspapers and on the social media to get people thinking about bird conservation. So when you think about conservation in the United States, you often think about protected areas. So you're thinking about national parks and national wildlife refuges and places like that. But if you're doing conservation in other parts of the world, in many places, you've got to do conservation on working lands, places where people are trying to make a living and doing bird conservation at the same time. In Latin America and the Caribbean, even if they call a place a protected area, there's often productive activities within the borders of those protected areas. And so that's really still part of conservation, even if you think you're working on a protected area. So in working lands, some working lands are better for conservation than others. For example, we're going to talk about grasslands today, and natural grasslands are really good for bird conservation. But there's a lot of attempts to convert those grasslands to soybean fields or pine plantations or eucalyptus plantations, which are not good for conservation, oil palm plantations. So if you are working in an area where people can make a living and they have a habitat that's good for bird conservation, a real goal is to improve the profitability of that land in ways that are not incompatible with bird conservation, so that the owners of that land are not tempted to convert it to other uses. So I was giving this talk to the American Ornithologists Society. I'm trying to recruit younger ornithologists to do this kind of work. And we have sort of our gut feeling on what kind of practices are good for birds and aren't good for birds, and what kind of things are going to cause real problems for birds. But we need the research. If you're trying to do conservation at scale, you've got to convince other people that what we're recommending will really make a difference, both for the landowners trying to make a profit and for the birds that we're trying to be conserved. In many cases, we try to get licensing. So you try to get a bird-friendly stamp on a particular practice. And if you're going to put a bird-friendly stamp on a practice, you want to be sure that what people are doing is really good for birds after all. And so it takes ornithologists to do that. And one thing is you can just look out there and see, are there more birds on the right of this photo than there are on the left of this photo? And we actually would predict that there were. We'd also predict that there are different birds on the left of this photo than there are on the right of this photo. So sometimes you want a mix of different habitat uses. But presence and absence doesn't always tell the tale. Sometimes a bird might be out there in the left-hand side there and still not do very well. There might be predators perched in those trees eating all the birds that are in those open grasslands. Whereas on the right-hand side, the grassland birds might be able to hide from predators. And so you don't want to know just if birds are there, but how are they doing? So demographic data means survival and reproduction. So the non-breeding season, which is where I work mostly, you're interested in how well are the birds surviving all through the winter. In order to find that out, you need a scientist out there, usually putting up mist nets, catching birds, putting tags on those birds, and seeing how long those tag birds stay in the neighborhood. And you want to have some tagging done on the left-hand side, some tagging done on the right-hand side, so that you know in comparison, not only which species are using those two habitats, but how well those species are surviving in a controlled way to make it into a scientific experiment. So most of my talk, I'm going to just go through some examples of work that we do in Latin America on working lands. And one of the places we've been working for 20 years, and I've only been working for the Forest Service for 10 years, so this is a project that started long before I was with the Forest Service, is in Chihuahua, Mexico, which is a desert grassland. And it's actually a fight between, is it a desert or is it a grassland? They're trying to actually improve the grasslands. So trying to convert it. Probably 100 years ago, 200 years ago, it was all grassland, but it got overgrazed tremendously. And so a lot of the grassland was turned into desert. So a lot of the work now is to turn the desert back into grassland. And if you can create good grassland, there's 15 or 20 species of grassland birds that will spend the winter there. And some of the ones we're most worried about are Sprague's Pipit and Baird's Sparrow. And I don't have a lot of bird pictures for you today. So write down these names and Google the birds if you're not familiar to them. These are Western birds. And these are two species that breed in Canada and North Dakota and places like that, and then winter mostly in Mexico. And if we can convert the pastures to, the desert to pastures, then these species do really, really well. The other interesting thing that we're fighting in Chihuahua, Mexico, is that there's a group of farmers that have come in that are irrigating their land and growing crops in the grassland. And you can only do that under irrigation. The irrigation comes from groundwater. The groundwater in Chihuahua is very, very limited. So our concern is that people are going to come in, use up all the groundwater and go away, and there won't be any water left to support the grass, and it'll all turn into desert. So these are the kinds of issues that we're fighting in north central Mexico. So the way we're fighting it is reaching out to the landowners who are trying to make money off of their cattle and giving them techniques to improve the quality of the grass for the cattle, which also improves the quality of the grass for the birds. So there's 436,000 acres that are protected by the private landowners. And there's a sharing of what we call regenerative grazing techniques, and those techniques are being used on over 100,000 acres of grasslands throughout the Sustainable Grazing Network among 25 landowners, and 6 years where the Bird Conservancy of the Rockies has gone in and counted the birds to see how well the birds are doing. And sure enough, the birds do much better in areas where they're doing these regenerative practices to improve the grasslands. It's interesting because if you look through the central United States, we have the shortgrass prairies just east of the Rocky Mountains. And then we have the tallgrass prairies in Iowa and Illinois and states like that. And then the grasslands go up to Canada and into Mexico. And then there's very important grasslands in Venezuela and Colombia. There's important grasslands in Bolivia. And then there's important grasslands in the southern part of South America. If you think of the pampas of Argentina, the grasslands of Uruguay. Uruguay is one of the few countries that's almost completely grasslands historically. And then southeastern Brazil and southern Paraguay also have grasslands that are hosting a number of birds that breed in the United States and Canada and go all the way south to southern South America. We call it the Southern Cone. So BirdLife International has national conservation partnerships in 120 countries around the world. And so they have partners in these 4 countries in the Southern Cone, and they're working together on the South American Grasslands Alliance, where they've got over 500 ranchers and grass-fed beef certification. So you can't buy South American grass-fed beef in the United States. You can buy it in Europe, and you can buy it in Uruguay and Argentina. But in the United States, Audubon has a certification program, and you can buy Audubon certified grass-fed beef if you're lucky. I mean, I don't think it's a huge market yet, but it's something we're trying to do in the United States as well in the southern part of South America. So the nice thing about certification is 2 different things. In one case, the supermarket gives priority to the grass-fed beef, the certified beef. And it's not only certified because it's good for wildlife, it's also certified because it's good for gauchos. And in Argentina and Uruguay, people love their gauchos, and it's history. It's like our cowboys. It's like people want to go out west and spend a week on a ranch pretending that we're cowboys. And it's the same in Argentina and Uruguay, is that everybody loves the gaucho lifestyle, and they're willing to pay a little bit more for their beef to support the gaucho lifestyle, which is also supporting some pretty cool birds. So in some cases, you get preferential access to markets. In other cases, you get a premium in price, which can really keep people in business that are otherwise working in a fairly marginal economic environment. So not only are these the migratory birds that they share with North America, but there's these endemic species in the grasslands that are found only on these ranches that are really well managed. And so it's really a win-win situation for some super rare endemic species and some super long distance migrants. So that's kind of the grassland story. And of course, there's a number of forestry stories as well. We all know that we use a lot of lumber. All countries of the world, all people of the world are using a tremendous amount of timber. And in many cases, that's led to massive clear cuts and loss of forests. There's also conversion of forests to other habitat types, or just straight into suburbia or urban areas. And so we work many places in Latin America to support community forestry, where the communities can create value-added products where they can make a profit out of just small-scale forestry. So it might be a really tiny clear cut, or it might be selective forestry, where just a few trees are taken down and created and used to create high value products so that the forestry is sustainable and the forests stay fairly constant over many generations of people living in the area. So there's a lot of people out there reaching out to these communities and teaching them how to create these high value products and bringing in really small sawmills so that the local communities can process their own logs and create their own products. And then a lot of these non-governmental organizations help these communities to sell those products. And of course, if we go down to Latin America and we're tourists, there's often a ton of products that are locally produced by communities. And by our buying those products and bringing them back to our grandchildren, we really help those communities resist the temptation to allow their forests to be clear cut. Again, look up golden-cheeked warbler. It's a Texas breeding endemic. It breeds only in central Texas and then winters primarily in southern Mexico, but also in Guatemala and Honduras. And it's an absolutely beautiful warbler, very similar to our black-throated green warbler, but I think a little bit more beautiful. So we're doing a very similar project in Ecuador, and the Chocó of Ecuador is in the southwestern part of Ecuador, northwestern part of Ecuador, close to the coast, and an area that's just being clear cut at a rate that's heartbreaking. So again, a huge coalition of non-governmental organizations is working in this area to try to find communities that are willing to slow down the rate of deforestation and trying to provide those communities with a way of making a living in a way that they don't have to completely clear the forest. And so the forest birds will survive. And it's a place I'm dying to go to because there are just some really narrowly endemic species that can only be found in this area, as well as a pretty wide variety of what we call neotropical migrants that breed here in North America, winter in Latin America, and olive-sided flycatcher is sort of the flagship bird for this project. So you probably all know about shade-grown coffee. I hope a lot of you are drinking shade-grown coffee. It's a little bit more expensive, but it usually tastes better too. When I worked with the American Birding Association, I was able to help the Thanksgiving Coffee Company invent a product that is still called songbird coffee. And the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Institute has been a real leader in this for, I don't know, 30 or 40 years. And so there's a lot of bird-friendly coffee on the market, which is almost all shade coffee. And that means that the coffee plants, which are fairly small shrubs, are grown under a canopy of trees. And there's a huge variety of types of shade. Some of it they call, oh, I forget what the name of it is, but it's like artisanal shade, where it's like you're in a forest, except they take off the understory bushes and replace them with coffee plants. But all the rest of the forest looks just like it did before the coffee was grown. And then there's these almost open canopy shade coffee plantations where they just plant one or two varieties of trees and they're fairly widespread, but they still provide some shade. It still provides some habitat for migratory birds. And so it's a really important project. It's very widespread in Latin America. Unfortunately, it's not ubiquitous. Countries like Colombia and Costa Rica are producing mostly sun coffee. And if you look at a sun coffee plantation, you'd be hard pressed to find a bird anywhere. And so adding any shade is valuable. And if you go to these really heavy shade coffee plantations, it's some of the best birding around because it's just, the canopies are just loaded with birds. Now, if you're a coffee farmer, this is great, but some coffee farmers cannot make a living with shade-grown coffee. And often the problem is it's not enough sun, it's too much humidity, and a fungus can come in, and you can't grow a coffee under fungus. And so they resist having shade. And so David King, who's a professor at University of Massachusetts in Amherst, and who is also a researcher with the United States Forest Service, is working with a group called Mesoamerican Development Corporation, and they've got what they call integrated open canopy coffee. And so what they do is for every hectare of coffee, they require the coffee producer to save at least an equal area of primary forest. And this is really important for conservation because it turns out that shade coffee is really good for migratory birds, but it's not very good for resident birds. And so if you're interested in saving resident endemic birds, you need to save the primary forest. They need the understory, they need the undisturbed habitat in order for the resident birds to do as well as the migrant birds do in the shade coffee plantation. So there's no extraction permit of the forest. It really is a natural habitat. Let's see what else I had on this. So in these areas, you have really high coffee yields, in part because this primary forest supports insectivorous birds, which go out in the coffee plantations and eat some of the pests that attack the coffee plants. So by having a natural forest, the birds can go in, eat off some coffee pests and improve the yield of the coffee, and you don't have shade, and so the sun is also increasing the yield of the coffee. The other thing that's interesting is that there are other things in coffee that are bad for the environment. So a lot of the coffee processing uses up a lot of water. Sometimes they're using chemicals to process the coffee. So this whole integrated open canopy coffee introduces other really high quality practices that are producing great coffee. The carbon credits come from the primary forest. So if you're saving primary forest, it's sequestering carbon and lowering the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. And that is producing a value that impact investors are willing to pay for. So there is increasing certification now of these IOC coffee plantations. And this is starting out in Honduras. So if you look for Honduran coffee, you may be finding some of this integrated open canopy coffee. Sometimes you're drinking shade-grown coffee, even if you don't know it. Mostly organic coffee is shade-grown, and most of the fair trade coffee is also shade-grown. So a lot of times it'll be all three things, and we're doing a lot of good things for the world by having all those things certified and supporting the small coffee growers instead of the huge corporate coffee farms. So it's not just coffee that's grown under shade. There's a lot of different agroforestry practices. In Colombia, there's cardamom. In the Dominican Republic, there is cacao. So a lot of the chocolate can be shade grown. The cardamom can be shade grown. And we work with a professor, Gabriel Colorado, at the University of Columbia, who studies cerulean warblers, Canada warblers, golden-winged warblers, and how well they're doing in coffee plantations, cardamom plantations. And then he compares the survival of these overwintering birds to their survival in intact natural habitats. And some species do really well in the agroforestry areas, and some don't do as well at all. You can do agroforestry for cattle. So some cattle do pretty well with shade trees in the grassland plantations. And you can do subsistence crops. Some communities can grow all the food that they eat in shade and provide better habitat for birds and shade. But most of the research in agroforestry has happened in coffee and cacao, and now a little bit in cardamom. Costa Rica is one of those countries that always seems to be 3 or 4 steps ahead of everybody else in conservation, which is why we always encourage people to travel to Costa Rica. It doesn't hurt that they have 900 species of birds in a country the size of West Virginia, which is a fairly small state compared to Florida. So fabulous birding in Costa Rica and a chance to support some of the most far-thinking conservation people on the planet. The best national parks in Latin America started up in Costa Rica 40 years ago. But about 15 or 20 years ago, they looked around and they realized there was almost no forest outside of the national park. So it's a fairly economically prosperous country. And so people were planting crops like pineapple, bananas, some really heavily impacted by pesticide crops. So they're finding really high pesticide levels and really high levels of deforestation. And so 15 years ago, they started coming up with incentives for reforesting areas outside of national parks. And the best of those programs is called Payment for Ecosystem Services. And it's available to farmers who are growing a wide variety of crops. And Costa Rica Bird Observatories is taking advantage of this program. And a couple of years ago, they started a program in an area called Dota, which is in the foothills of the Costa Rica mountains, kind of go down the center of the country, where golden-winged warblers spend the winter. And so they help plant a huge number of trees and shrubs and things that the golden-winged warblers like. And the farmers are receiving payment for ecosystem services from the Costa Rican government, help cover their costs and reward them for providing good habitat for birds. And this works so well for golden-winged warbler that they're now working down near La Selva natural area in areas that are really good for wood thrush. And so again, they've got farmers that are making a living on their farms and also planting vegetation on the edges of their farms that are really good for wood thrush, and setting a great example for how to do conservation in Central America. So get a little closer to home, we're out in the Bahamas, where Kirtland's warbler, as far as we know, only winters in the Bahama Islands. And they only winter on 3 or 4 islands primarily. One island is Eleuthera. And so Joe Wonderly is a retired Forest Service researcher. Dave Ewert is almost about to retire. He's been working with the Nature Conservancy for about 30 years. And together they've been working about 20 years on the island of Eleuthera to improve the wintering habitat for Kirtland's warbler. Now, unfortunately, Walt Disney, I think you might know some folks from Walt Disney, are going to build a really big, their plan is to build a really big resort on Eleuthera. So we're very concerned about the impacts that will have on habitat for Kirtland's warbler. And so if that happens, it's going to be really important to improve the productivity of the other parts of Eleuthera. There's also an island called San Salvador, which hosts a number of Kirtland's warblers, and the Cat Islands also hold a number of Kirtland's warblers. And you may know that they breed almost entirely in the state of Michigan. But things have been going so well for Kirtland's warblers that some are showing up in Ontario, some are showing up in Wisconsin. So things are happening well for Kirtland's warbler on the breeding grounds. So we have to make sure that things happen equally well on the wintering grounds. The other thing is, if you look at the Bahamas, most of those islands are really, really shallow. So if there is the sea level rise that there's predicted to happen, these islands are going to get smaller and smaller. So it turns out that in 10 years of study, Dave and Joe found out that Kirtland's warblers feed on mostly berries in the wintertime. And there's a couple different fruits that are very important for Kirtland's warbler. But if the habitat isn't really well maintained, you'll have trees grow up, they'll shade out the fruit. You'll have weedy species grow up that shade out the fruits. But if you have goats, the goats will eat the bad stuff, and for some reason, they leave the fruiting plants. And so poor Dave and Joe thought they were ornithologists, and their job was to study birds. And before they retired, they both did the goat farmers. They actually didn't do the goat farming themselves, but they were working with the experts on the Eleuthera who are experts in goat farming. And so they're, like a lot of places, goat farmers tend to be older, and the kids aren't that excited about goat farming. But to have this to work on Eleuthera, they've got to convince some kids to stay in the goat farming business. So that's really the cutting edge of conservation on the islands is how do you work with the goat farmers to keep these fruiting bushes fruiting? Now, I said that Dave and Joe really didn't become goat farmers, but we work with conservationists in Bolivia, where this buff-breasted sandpiper stops over on its way south, and they couldn't find any cattle ranchers who grazed their grass and to prevent woody invasion of grasslands. So they are becoming cattle ranchers. So you have to be really careful. You start out as a bird watcher or ornithologist, and you might turn out to become a goat farmer or a cattle rancher. which is good for the birds, but might not be what you or I had planned. So here's another really good habitat for birds is rice. And I've always scratched my head about this because rice can be one of the most heavily used pesticide crops on the planet. And in some places, the birds seem to get along anyway, even with the pesticides. But if you want to really be good habitat for rice, organic rice is the way to go. So keep your eyes open for organic rice. And remember, wild rice isn't rice at all. It's a whole different crop. I love wild rice. A lot of it is harvested in Minnesota and Wisconsin, but it's not real rice. So we're talking about real rice here. And not only is rice important in Colombia, which is what I'm talking about here, it's also very important in Arkansas and Louisiana and in California. One of the best birding festivals you can go to is in Louisiana, where you can ride on the tractor where they're harvesting the rice. You can have yellow rails and black rails jumping up in front of the harvester right in front of your eyes. And it's about the only easy way to see black rails and yellow rails on the planet. And the rice harvester is going to do that disturbance anyway, so you're not adding any disturbance that wouldn't happen without you. But anyway, because rice is grown in water, is attracting a huge number of birds that like shallow fields. We've got the rails and the shorebirds. And conservation organizations are constantly working with farmers to promote all the techniques that are good for birds. And so in California, Point Blue Conservation Sciences, Audubon, California, and a number of other organizations, the California Waterfowl Association, all work with the rice farmers to make sure that they manage the rice fields in ways that are good for shorebirds, rails, and ducks. So also look for organic rice when you're out shopping. Salt, we all require salt. It's just the right amount. And there's a lot of places where birds love salt. In some places, they just roost in salt production areas and then fly out to feed in other places. In some places, the birds are actually feeding in the brine on the salt production facilities. Flamingos are pink because of the brine shrimp that grow in the brine in salt production areas, either natural salt production areas or artificial salt production areas. And so brine shrimp are a really important resource in the Great Salt Lake for phalaropes and in South America and Africa for flamingos. So in this case, in Ecuador, our Wilson's phalaropes are breeding in the Western United States and Canada and using the salt lakes in those areas. And they fly all the way down. They actually fly through Ecuador down to South America, often using salt production facilities. So Aves y Conservación is the leading bird conservation non-government organization in Ecuador, and they have a great relationship with a major salt facility called Equisol in Ecuador, and they're working with Equisol to make sure they're minimizing any interference they do with the shorebird use of the salt facility there. And this is being reproduced in many places in the Americas. Shrimp is similar. We still eat a lot of wild-grown shrimp. Of course, there's a lot of shrimp production in the Gulf of Mexico, but increasingly the production of shrimp is happening in shrimp farms. Some of these shrimp farms are right on the coast and creating quite a bit of habitat destruction. In some cases, they're just a little bit inland, and so the mangroves are actually doing okay, but the habitats just inland from the mangroves are turning into shrimp farms. And again, these are very attractive to shorebirds. Sometimes they scare the shrimp farmers because the shorebirds will come in and, or some of the water birds will come in and eat the shrimp while the pond levels are declining and they're just ready to harvest the shrimp. And farmers don't want to see the water birds come in and eat their crop. So we're working with the shrimp farmers to protect their shrimp. At the same time, the farmers don't feel like they gotta go out and shoot or otherwise kill all the birds. Again, you can see these ledgers are roosting, and the other species of shorebirds are roosting on the dikes of the shrimp farm. And so again, if the shrimp farmers are careful in how they use the dikes, it's a great resting area at high tide for the shorebirds, which are then flying out into the mud flats nearby at lower tide to breed. A Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network has a network of over 100 sites that are shorebirds all through the Americas, and it's run by Manomet Conservation Sciences out of Massachusetts. So it's a great organization working with shrimp farmers, working with the salt producers, and working with all the over 100 sites to do as the best shorebird conservation that they can. I think we're close to the end here. I just wanted to report that I haven't become a cattle rancher and I haven't become a goat farmer, but I have become a cattle watcher. And so when you go down to the Southern Cone, I forgot to mention that every year there's what they call an encuentro. So basically there's a meeting every year of the ranchers. And so the cattle ranching initiative started out with bird conservationists trying to save birds. But the cattle ranchers got so excited about the project that they've taken over the leadership now. So they organize these annual meetings where all the cattle ranchers come together and talk about all the best ways to improve the productivity of grass or cows and how to improve their profitability. And if you go to a bird conference, you go out and go bird watching as a group, and you get in your bus and you go see as many birds as you can see. If you go to a cattle ranchers convention, you go out and see the cattle. And the gauchos, they get out on their horses and they push all the cattle towards the front, and all the cattle watchers line up and they ooh and ah about how beautiful all the cattle are. And so here we are all organized. There's our bus. We're all organized to become cattle watchers. And so it's a great hobby. I hope you'll all pick it up and come up bird watching.
Well, thank you, Greg. Amazing. Someone says it's amazing how interconnected we are. I'll let
Amen.
I'll let Susan take care of the questions like she always does.
So if anybody has any questions about anything Greg said, just go ahead and put them in the chat and I'll read them out loud.
And there's my email. So if people think of things after the talk, feel free to email me. And I love talking about this stuff. I hope you could tell.
I just want to know how we can get everybody to start planting vegetation along the edge of, like, not just farms, but freeways and things like that.
Yeah, so I work a lot with monarch butterflies, and that's tremendously important for butterflies is, plant nectar plants all along the highways. I'm a little nervous when people plant good things for wildlife in the middle of the highways because then they've got to cross the traffic each way. But to plant on the edge of the highways, they've got over a 50-50 chance of staying out of the highway.
That's true.
When they move to a different habitat. But yeah, there's all kinds of waste areas that can be converted to natural habitat. And of course, a lot of our yards are bigger than they need to be, and we can convert our yards into really nice natural habitat as well.
Yeah, and actually, what are the top things we as individuals can do? This is a question from Deborah.
That's my number one priority is to start local, improve your yard for habitat. I'm vice president for Audubon Society of Northern Virginia, and we have adopted the Potomac River Important Bird Area. And so we work with land managers at the Potomac River Important Bird Area to help them improve their habitats, to help them get rid of invasive species, and to plant more native species. We, of course, have an advocacy group with our Audubon chapter, and we're very active in all kinds of, especially habitat-based issues with the Audubon Society. And there are these non-governmental organizations throughout Latin America that you can support. And I think I was talking with Deborah about this, and Birds Caribbean is one of my favorite non-governmental organizations. They work throughout the Caribbean. They do fabulous work. They help the local people after the hurricanes. They help the birds after the hurricanes. And they just do a tremendous number of things. And if we can support those non-governmental organizations, it really goes a long, long way for conservation throughout the flyway.
Very good. We also had another kind of question. It said, if the right grasses are grown, it benefits both the cattle and the birds. Is this correct?
Yeah, and it's a triple whammy because it's also good for carbon. So it turns out that annual grasses, have fairly short roots and they don't store much carbon. But perennial grasses, the kind of grasses that were in the Midwest United States and throughout Latin America before the Europeans came, those perennial grasses have incredibly deep roots. And so there's carbon stored in the roots and there's carbon stored in the soil underneath these grasslands. So they're almost as productive as tropical forests in terms of sequestering carbon. So a really productive grassland produces healthier cows, they gain weight faster, and produce more profit for the ranchers. They provide habitat for birds, they sequester carbon. Now, the one thing is that grass-fed beef is better for the planet than the other kinds of beef. So a normal beef is going onto a big cattle yard and is eating corn and other grains. And this produces more fat, which is worse for our health. And it produces more of a carbon footprint, so it's not as healthy for the planet. And so we have to sort of change our palates a little bit to get interested in grass-fed beef. It's not quite as rich because it's not as fatty as the traditional beef. But if you change your palate just a little bit, it changes beef from being kind of a downer for the environment to being something that's really positive for the environment.
Very nice. I didn't know that about the grasses. That's really interesting about the long-rooted grasses.
Yeah, so, a lot of people are out there doing reforestation projects to sequester carbon. And unfortunately, they're doing a lot of reforestation in Uruguay. Well, Uruguay never had any trees. So you can't reforest a place that didn't have trees. So in Uruguay, they really need to be saving their perennial grasslands and trying to make a living off their perennial grasslands rather than planting trees. And there's other places like that too.
So we just have to figure out how to put it in the front yard along grass.
If you make your front yard into a garden, you can make a really pretty garden and put all kinds of nectar plants in there. And all of a sudden the people walk by one day and they'll see all the butterflies in your yard and think it's a whole lot more beautiful than their grass was.
Very good.
Now, do you have butterflies year round where you are?
Yes.
Yes.
That's cool. We don't have any butterflies right now. We got to wait till spring.
But it's kind of nice to have something special.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, I will have to say, I think they go down a little bit in the winter.
So one of the things I found out as a wildlife biologist is most of the people that became wildlife biologists did it because they wanted to work with animals or birds or whatever. And a lot of them went into it because they really like animals better than they like people. And one of the things we found out was that wildlife conservation is a people first process. And 99% of successful wildlife conservation is working with people and having them see the benefits of doing wildlife conservation. And so those of us that went into the field to get away from people kind of failed, which is a good thing because the people who care about wildlife are always fun people to be around.
Now, we did have a question. I don't know, Deborah, if you pitch on this between you two. It says, is there a type of grass seed you would recommend for putting in your yard?
Yeah, so I don't know that for Orlando. We can look that up. But again, the key is to look for a perennial grass and not an annual grass. And look for a grass. I mean, Florida historically has always had grasslands. So look for a grass that's native to Florida. So rather than us answering the question, there should be native seed companies in your part of Florida. And so if you just Google a native seed for Central Florida, find a company that specializes in that and ask them that question and tell them that you're looking for perennial grass to grow in the area. And that's where your expertise is going to be.
Very good.
And they'll have all kinds of great native plants that you can add to your yard in addition to the grass. Or that you can buy through your local protected area. Or our Audubon chapter gives grants to schools. We have a lot of schools that want to put in especially pollinator gardens and are growing a lot of native plants in pollinator gardens in schools. And so the kids have a really great education, how to be a gardener and how to appreciate native plants and native wildlife.
Greg, in the Plants for Birds area, we've been promoting the concept of the caterpillars, birds for the caterpillars, learned from Doug Tallamy. Is that what's going on in the coffee? That the shade trees are rich in caterpillars for the migratory birds?
So probably, well, yeah, so definitely, yeah, well, some of these birds eat a wide variety of things. Most of the birds that fly south are flying south because we don't have enough insects for them in North America in the winter. A lot of our birds are flying south. They're hitting the canopies of these shade-grown coffee plantations and finding a lot of insects in those canopies. So I think you've got it exactly right. Those trees are supporting caterpillars. And of course, the Doug Tallamy view of the world is that a beautiful plant isn't a plant that has perfect leaves. It's a plant that has holes in its leaves and butterflies flying around it. Mm-hmm. And that's got to be true everywhere. If we're buying plants that are heavily laden with pesticides, we're not doing the wildlife any favors at all.
All right, and I think somebody said the same for Florida would be for New York, correct? To contact the native plant.
Yeah, so that's one of the cool things that's happened over the last 10 to 20 years is that more and more of these native seed companies have come up. And a lot of them are just little mom and pop companies. So I think every state has them. And in New York, you know, it's going to be different. If you live up by the Great Lakes, the Adirondacks, or on Long Island, or in Central New York, each place is going to have very different plant preferences. Same in Florida. If you're on the Panhandle, or if you're down in Miami, or if you're in Central Florida, there'll be very different native plants that will work for your area. So always look for a seed company, a native seed company that specializes in your neighborhood. And most people have really good luck finding that these days. Right. The other interesting thing is that the birds use very different plants from what the butterflies use, very different plants from what the bees use. And so you really need a nice diversity of plants in any habitat to support all the kind of wildlife we care about.
Very good.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Greg.
You bet.
And thanks everyone for coming.
Yes.
So that's a slice of my life.
That looks good though.
Until 2 years ago, I used to travel and visit some of these places. Now I don't remember how to do that anymore because of COVID. So I hope to go back and see it again sometime.
All right.
And I hope you get to travel and see tropical birds as well.
Thank you so much. And everybody will see you next week for Scott Weidensol's talk on YouTube.
Don't miss Scott. He's amazing.
Yes. On our YouTube channel live.
Very cool.
Have a good evening.
Okay.
Thanks for coming.
Good night, everybody.